Sometimes there are simply no words for the rage that a good villain can imbue in players. And from the grotesque to the plain annoying, the horror genre has plenty of big bads out to torment players, which makes it all the more satisfying when they're finally on the receiving end of this punishment. So with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 evil horror video game villains you couldn't wait to kill. Number 8, CONSTANCE HACKETT, the QUARRY. The QUARRY is a hugely suspenseful successor to supermassive games' Until Dawn, try saying that 3 times in a row, and features even more villains out to get the game's cast of characters. Now, while there are werewolves roaming around the camp, there are also decidedly human villains in the form of the HACKETT family. These sinister werewolf hunters might not all be bad depending on your playthrough, but the matriarch of the family, Constance, is undeniably a bad seed who seeks vengeance on the camp counselors that you're trying to save. Now, Constance is a nasty piece of work. The kind of my way or the highway old-timer who would rather kill innocents than even have a perceived threat to her family remain alive. And if anyone, even her sons, do anything out of line, she'll see that as a betrayal. This is an iron fist mother and grandmother. And now, don't get me wrong, all of this makes for a great character, and her remorseless approach makes her potential death, by way of a scuffle resulting in her face being blown off, surprisingly satisfying. Constance was prepared to escalate things to the point where everyone in her crosshairs could die, and while you might not have intended to kill her, you won't regret it all that much. Number 7, HYPERION, RETURNAL. Most of the bosses in Returnal instill a sense of bloodlust in the player. After all, they're all designed to be gatekeepers for this roguelike shooter, and defeat at their hands doesn't just mean getting knocked back to a checkpoint, but having to start your entire run again, with your items, health, and upgrades all reset. However, it's actually the 4th boss in the game, and arguably the most forgiving as it just knocks you back to the start of that particular stage, that sees a real rivalry with the player start to come to the forefront. And that's because HYPERION is the boss with the most personality, taunting you by playing an organ rendition of Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper before and during this fight. So by the 10th attempt, hearing the opening bars while approaching this boss arena gets the adrenaline pumping to the point where you're practically gagging to shove the organ where the sun don't shine. It doesn't help either that the boss is hard, slathering the screen in projectiles that can easily overwhelm the player. It is a glorious fight though, and you'll be buzzing to put this guy in the dirt. Number 6, LUDWIG the Accursed, BLOODBORNE. And speaking of roadblock bosses, there's an argument to be made that LUDWIG the Accursed is the most difficult boss in From Software's Bloodborne, yes, maybe even more than the Orphan of Kos. Now, this action title is a superb horror game, blending Lovecraftian nightmares with Bram Stoker-style gothic beasties, and its DLC, The Old Hunters, more than lives up to the quality of the base game. And its first big test is LUDWIG the Accursed, a 2-stage menace of a boss fight that demands absolute perfection to beat. In stage 1, you're fighting against a hulking beast who can decimate your health with so much as a dash across the screen, and if you somehow get him to stage 2, Ludwig regains more of his former humanity and attacks you with sweeping blade strikes and projectiles. Put simply, you will die. You'll die over and over, and even worse, no doubt run out of healing item blood vials. Then you'll have to go farming just to get prepared to take on the boss one more time, where you'll no doubt die again and be back to square one. It is incredibly tough, and you'll have no remorse when you finally best him. Number 5, the XENOMORPH, Alien Isolation. Alien Isolation was marketed on being closer in tone and story to the original Ridley Scott movie than the action-packed James Cameron sequel. The idea was to replicate the retro-futuristic aesthetic of the 70s flick, focus on the horror, and crucially, only feature one alien that you could not kill. Except that last part was a little bit of a lie. See, after being terrorized by the Xenomorph for half of the game, you do get a chance for a bit of payback. Echoing her mother, protagonist Amanda Ripley is able to stave off her attacker just long enough to lock it in part of a ship that she then ejects into space. It's a thrilling sequence, and while you might not have gotten your hands directly dirty, it is a satisfying moment to finally get your own back. After all, this is a monster that has probably killed the player dozens of times already. Being unable to fight back outside of a flamethrower that doesn't do any permanent damage, up until this point as well, all you can do is hide, making the act of revenge even sweeter. Of course, this feeling only lasts until Amanda finds an alien nest in another part of the ship, but hey, for a few seconds there, it's pure catharsis. Number 4, Nemesis Resident Evil 3. Sometimes size really does matter. Remarkably brainy by the rather low standards of the undead, Nemesis towers over human protagonists in both versions of Resident Evil 3 and terrorizes them at every turn. Born in a laboratory, this monstrous rocket launcher enthusiast is unleashed in a bid by the Umbrella Corporation to silence the STARS police team from outing their, shall we say, rather unethical experiments. And as you might have guessed, this is a cool concept, but for players it makes for a relentless obstacle who gets increasingly infuriating to deal with as Nemesis just keeps coming back for another round of violence. Perhaps the biggest aspect of Nemesis that just makes it so damn killable is the endless mutating in the closing stretch of the game. Every time the player seemingly gets the better of the monster, it grows tentacles or vomits poison everywhere. Needless to say, when the player gets to choose between executing Nemesis and leaving it to likely die in an impending nuclear blast, yeah, this game was pretty wild back in the day, most jump on that first option. And in the remake especially, its hilariously gory death is more than cathartic. Like, just look at the trail this thing leaves behind. Number 3, Sander Cohen, BIOSHOCK. A man of many talents, Sander Cohen is one of BIOSHOCK's most sadistic, unpleasant figures. In New York Artist, Cohen's move to Rapture ended the way most Rapture-related things do, a descent into pure horror movie level evil. Everywhere players go in the early parts of the game, there's pieces of Cohen's art to enjoy. His victims can be found completely covered in plaster as monuments to his cruelty. And when the player reaches Fort Frolic, Cohen makes his insidious presence felt by cutting off radio contact. From there, a hapless pianist is brutally blown up for reasons that presumably made sense to the depraved Cohen, as the confused protagonist Jack gets caught up in his hijinks. For players who grow tired of Cohen's mood swings, like seriously, this guy sends splices after you just because he randomly thinks you're a doubter just on a whim, and manipulations, there's not one but two options of how to kill him off. The first option is a fiery boss fight when the player first gets the displeasure of meeting Cohen in person, but if the player's hesitant to engage with this menace before getting to know him a little better, there's always turning up at his apartment and killing his trusty Houdini splicer dancers. This act will send the mustachioed madman into a rage, thus initiating the other boss fight option. There's also not killing Cohen as an option, but let's face it, I think very few players will roll in that direction after meeting him, especially your first time through. Number 2, Stefano, the Evil Within 2. And speaking of wacko artists, Stefano Valentini is a spooky sociopathic serial killer who sees beauty and art in the murders he commits. After losing an eye taking photos on a battlefield, Stefano came to believe that true beauty could only be captured in the moment of death. And in order to get that perfect shot, he seems pretty happy to cause the death himself. For Sebastian Castellanos, this is another spoke in the wheel of misfortune his life's become since the first game ended. With a dead daughter, or is she, a failed marriage and a growing drinking habit, players will likely be crushed by how Sebastian's life has turned out since they last saw him. Stefano, vile at the best of times, is made all the more reprehensible by the torment and anguish he subjects the already downtrodden Sebastian to. From torture to mockery to setting a variety of monsters on the poor guy, Stefano's cruelty gets very grating throughout the first half of the game. So by the time his concluding boss fight arrives, most players will be itching to teach him a lesson and send him packing. Number 1, PIGGSY, Manhunt. Oh boy. For those who thought Manhunt's Lionel Starkweather was a little bit much, the most absurd of his seemingly countless henchmen is here to crank it up a notch. So who exactly is PIGGSY? Well, he's an erratic chap whose favourite things include chainsaws and homicide. He's also not a big fan of that whole clothes thing, bar the skinned pig head that he wears over his face. Essentially, if Leatherface and the ugly naked guy from Friends got into that fusion machine from The Fly, this is the stomach-churning result you'd have to deal with. In a game bloated with sadism, cruelty, and depravity, this oddity definitely takes the cake, giving the game an unseemly icky vibe whenever he shows up. An ace performer in stark weather snuff flicks, PIGGSY lives in the director's attic, munching on the remains of his countless victims. Even the other crooks and goons involved in Starkweather's snuff empire seem genuinely scared and appalled by PIGGSY's antics, and you can kinda see why. Look at this dude. Fortunately for players though, this animalistic fiend's kryptonite apparently is steel grates, which just happened to be on hand during his boss fight. And you cannot help but feel relief upon finally getting rid of this demented villain. And you also can't help but wonder just what the hell was going on in the Rockstar writer's room the day PIGGSY was conceived. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Are there any other horror game villains you couldn't wait to kill that I missed off here? And what did you do with this lot? I really want to know if people killed Constance like I did in the Quarry. Let me know, and while you're down there, if you could, please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.